So they got legal advice in
1 second, counsel.
Sure.
The objection is over. You may continue.
So they got legal advice in 2018, and I mean, think about it. You know, Direct Action Everywhere, the organizations that Ms. Santurio and Ms. Paul do investigative work for, you know, they're constantly coming across these situations where they're finding sick animals that are in need of help. It's reasonable to know, I'm sitting here looking at an animal that is suffering, that's dying, no one's going to help them. Is there anything I can do? And it's perfectly reasonable to say, I should probably ask a lawyer. And I would submit to you that anytime you ask a lawyer a question, isn't it kind of a little self-serving? So they could act accordingly. And they didn't just ask any old lawyer. They didn't Better Call Saul. They went to a, thank you, they went to a fairly reputable, not fairly, a reputable law professor and scholar in the field of criminal law at one of the top law schools in the country, UC Hastings School of Law. And that professor, attorney, gave them the advice of conditional release, and they relied on it. And I want to emphasize, this is not a free pass to do whatever you want, to go take anyone's animals. This is a highly conditional circumstances. If X, if you come across animals suffering and you feel the need that they have to be rescued, that they need immediate care, then Y. The law provides that you can rescue them. That's what they took from legal advice, and that's what they sincerely believed in their heart of hearts. So let's talk about the actual day of rescue. And I think it's important, there was a demonstration. And having learned what we learned about foster farms, unsurprising, it's consistent, they were protesting, but Ms. Santurio and Ms. Paul were not with that group, that were elsewhere. And they came upon a stopped transport truck, and what did they know? They knew there would likely be suffering birds on that truck. They knew that from their prior information. And that information is confirmed. I want you to remember the testimony of Mr. Hernandez, the driver from Foster Farms. Now, it's not his job to assess the health and safety and condition of the birds. Other people do that, right? They're supposed to do that. But what we learned is they don't. Because frequently, there are sick birds on that truck, there are injured birds on that truck, there are dead birds on that truck that die in transport. So it's not just some speculation, some wild guess that there will be birds that are suffering because of the neglect of Foster Farms on that truck. So yeah, they saw the opportunity to go investigate. Because as Ms. Paul told you, tenants of open rescue, we investigate and if we find birds that meet this condition, we rescue them. Because no one else is going to do it. And they need that help, and we believe that under those conditions, the law permits us to do it. And I want you to think about, the prosecution arguing, they just grabbed the first birds they did, so willy-nilly, very quickly. But that's not exactly the case, because you need to understand Ms. Santurio and Ms. Paul's background in care. Ms. Santurio told you at length, she cared for thousands of birds. Hundreds of them were sick. She had to identify sick birds out of a sea of them pretty quickly and efficiently. She told you that, her boss would come and, it's like I had a sixth sense at finding sick birds because she did it so often. It was a muscle memory for her. And she told you just about the signs that you can use to quickly identify sick birds. Splayed legs of Ethan. The pale comb of Ethan and Jax. And the fact that Jax couldn't even stand. And we saw that compare and contrast when I believe Mr. Hsiung was having Ms. Paul talk about the video. Stop the video and you could see the pale comb of Ethan and Jax and the bright red comb of another bird that's right there. And it's just a testament to how readily apparent the bird's conditions were. And then they ran to provide aid because they knew and they told you straight up, Foster Farms stopped them. They wouldn't let them provide aid. They would just put them back into the system that's going to throw these birds on the ground. They're certainly not going to help them. And this is a point I really want to emphasize. It's not just dumb luck that the two birds that they rescued were sick. It's not dumb luck. It was because it was a deliberate observation It's because the birds were so readily apparent sick. And it should be shocking to you that you can just look at any old truck, any old cage, and you easily come across birds in that condition. But it wasn't dumb luck, because certainly there was a bird equally as accessible as Ethan. You saw that on the side of the truck that was healthy. He wasn't taken. Again, not dumb luck. That was a deliberate choice to only take sick birds. And again, I think one of the jurors had that question. If Ethan wasn't sick, would you have taken him? And no, because it's conditional. We only take sick birds, because that is the only condition that we believe that rescue would be lawful. And what else do we know? Well, there's the aftercare. And the aftercare really confirmed that these birds were sick. You heard testimony about the substantial care and expense. You heard testimony from Ms. Yamada. And I will note that her testimony was unchallenged. The prosecution did not question her at all. Her testimony was unchallenged. Her observations of the birds, what she had to do, was unchallenged. And Ms. Yamada has experience with birds, has significant experience with birds. She was surprised that either of them made it through the night, and that Jax barely survived with a lot of care and expense. And unfortunately, Ethan didn't make it. So what did they do? They wanted to know why Ethan died. Because first, it would inform how they should take care of Jax, what he was exposed to. And it just confirmed what was readily apparent to Ms. Santurio. You heard the testimony of Dr. Rosenberg. The only person that's qualified to talk about the health of a bird in this trial, not some accountant from Foster Farms. In fact, Mr. Sutton told you the expert you rely on for health and diseases of birds is not me. It's a vet. And fortunately, you were able to hear from a vet. And I want to highlight, the prosecution talked about who this Dr. Rosenberg testified for, things like that. But critically, the prosecution presented no evidence, has not challenged the substance of what she opined on, much of which was the work of another veterinarian at one of the top vet schools in the country, UC Davis. There's no disagreement that Ethan was grossly sick. And in fact, Dr. Rosenberg told you this was one of the worst necropsies I've ever seen. This was one of the sickest birds I've ever seen. And you will have that exhibit of a necropsy. It has a lot of words that, quite frankly, I don't understand, which is why we rely on people like Dr. Rosenberg to explain. But Ethan had sepsis. He had hepatitis. He had E. coli and enterococcus, things that are zoonotic, things that can harm people. They were risk to people. And they're not just risk to people, they can even, through a rendering process, still be a risk to the ultimate consumer, people's pets. They're not safe, right? And it just confirms what Ms. Santurio and Ms. Paul already knew, which was obvious to them. They didn't need to spend 5 minutes inspecting the bird because the birds were that sick. And it's an uncontroverted confirmation that they were right. And again, it's not just dumb luck that the 2 birds they pulled from that truck that they rescued were sick. It was intentional and it was deliberate. So it returns us to this why question and mistake of law. Because it's an honest or good faith belief. It's not, if they were right. It's not what you would do. It's not even if their belief was reasonable. And they believed if an animal is suffering and needs help, the law provides you an exception to allow to do that, right? And it's conditioned. If X, if an animal is suffering and needs help, then Y. You can provide that animal aid. You can rescue that animal. So let's talk.
The law.
Ladies and gentlemen, again, the attorney's comments on the law is not the law, and the instruction is the law. So if you believe the attorney's comments mistakes the law, follow my instruction.
And this is what they believed. Because again, this is not about whether their belief is correct. It's whether they sincerely had a good faith belief. And they believed if an animal is suffering and needs help, that the legal advice that was given to them permitted them to rescue. That's what they believed. And that's what that intent element is all about. So let's talk about why they believe that. It's reliance. Again, they didn't just go to some hack lawyer. They went to a very reputable source, a law professor. And I can tell you, Mr. Little, Mr. Hsiung, Mr. Atwell, Mr. Colby, even Judge Lowe, we all listened to law professors. How we became lawyers. And if we are the ones that had to listen to law professors, Ms. Paul and Ms. Santurio, they're not lawyers. So it would be reasonable to rely on an authority to tell you what the law is, right? And the letter was specifically written for the situation when you're doing investigation and you come across a sick animal. Can you act? If you see an animal, as Ms. Paul told you, if you're going through a barn where chickens have been slaughtered and there's a dying chick that's abandoned, left there, can you do anything? If you don't, that bird's going to suffer and die and no one's going to do anything. Is there any legal recourse for that immediate situation? And that's really why this letter was provided, for that situation that they find themselves in as investigators, because they wanted to know. And the testimonies that they read, and they discussed it repeatedly. And again, it's their honest or good faith belief. And I want you to consider their earnestness in testifying, because you can consider how they testified. They sincerely believed, under those conditions, what we did was lawful. And their openness. They filmed it. They put it up on the internet. They put their names on it. They did that because they thought their conduct was lawful. They provided the evidence that the state's relying on. This wasn't some mystery of who done it, some masterclass in investigation. They served it up in a silver platter because they believed what we did was right. Why aren't you investigating law enforcement, the animal cruelty? But let's look at the application, because again, the prosecution wants to argue that this is some sort of stunt. But they applied the rules of the letter. There's no doubting that. And they only applied the rules of the letter. And I want you to think about it. If this were some stunt for some broader agenda, they did kind of a crappy job of it. Because they certainly could have gone back and taken more birds. The option was there to go take more birds out of that truck, to return and do all sorts of things like that. But they stopped at the 2 sick birds they had because that is consistent with what they believed. And the way mistake of law works is it negates a specific intent. And if you believe that your conduct is lawful, that you are entitled to take those birds, I submit to you that the evidence shows you that comprehensively and wholly negates the specific intent to deprive someone else of their property because you believe that you're entitled to take it. There is no deprivation if the law permits you to do that.
This states the law, court's ruling on the instructions.
Your Honor, this is people versus fine.
And approach.
Oh, hold on, sorry.
Counsel, ladies and gentlemen, I just remind you again, the law is what's the court's given to you, and it's in instruction 3411, so I think that's where counsel talking from. And so their comments on the law, if it conflicts with what's been given to you in instruction 3411, then please refer to instruction 3411. Okay.
So an individual's honest or good faith belief that their conduct is lawful is mutually exclusive from the requisite mental state. It's permanently deprived. That is, if you believe that you can lawfully rescue an animal, well, you're not unlawfully depriving anyone of their property. Those two things are mutually exclusive.
Your Honor, I have same objection.
Again, same admonition from the court.
So if you believe, based on the letter and the information that Ms. Santurio and Paul had, that their conduct, their belief that their conduct was lawful, the mistake of law permits you to find them not guilty. Now, finally, I want to talk about the burden of proof in this case. Because the burden is always with the prosecution. We have no burden. We could have sat here and played cards the entire trial. Would have been a boring trial. Hopefully, the trial wasn't boring. But it's the prosecution's burden to prove their case beyond a reasonable doubt. And beyond a reasonable doubt is the highest burden that we have in any courtroom in the United States of America. It's higher than when the state wants to take your children away. It's a more demanding standard than that. It's a more demanding standard when corporations go to war over billions of dollars. It is the highest standard. Proof beyond a reasonable doubt is not, I think they did it, I think they're guilty. It's not it. Proof beyond a reasonable doubt is not, probably did it, insufficient. Proof beyond a reasonable doubt is not, it's pretty likely they did it. It's still not sufficient. The burden that they have is higher. And Ms. Paul and Ms. Santurio's honest and good faith belief that their conduct was lawful is a reasonable doubt. And in order for the prosecution to prove their case beyond a reasonable doubt, they have to dispel that. And they simply can't. Because at the end of the day, Ms. Paul and Ms. Santurio cannot be called into question that they sincerely believed that what they were doing was the right thing, it was a necessary thing, it was a thing that they had specifically been instructed was lawful. And it's that belief that negates the requisite specific intent. And if you resolve that question in the way that the evidence supports, then you don't even need to consider that. And the last point I want to make is, there was a lot of discussion at the beginning of this trial. 2 chickens, it kind of feels like a waste of time. But I would agree with Mr. Colby. The law is the law. And it's not immaterial whether it's 2 chickens. It's the same thing if you see a cat in a yard dying and suffering and knowing that the owner of that cat is not going to provide it care, is going to provide it cruelty, and you are specifically advised, under that nuanced situation, you can rescue that cat. It is the same thing if an attorney tells you if you see a dog overheating in a car.
Objection, Your Honor. There's a specific law for that. This is different.
It's based on the belief.
Just move on.
But it doesn't matter that it's a chicken, that it's a cat, that it's a dog, that's even a person. If you believe that what you are doing is lawful, that you are permitted to do it in a crime-specific intent, like the one we have here, then you don't have the intent to commit the crime, because you are intending to do what you lawfully believe is a rescue, because no one else will. And that's precisely how Ms. Paul and Ms. Santurio applied the facts to them and applied what was told to them. And that's all we're asking you to do here. Because we know when you do that, you will reach the just and compassionate conclusion that is a not guilty verdict. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman.
Y'all remember my name's Wayne. I'm an attorney for Alexandra Paul, and in my opening statement I started with these words: rescuing sick and dying animals is not my crime. I shared those words with you and said there are 2 no's and a yes that will explain why. You remember that? Objection misstates the law.
Over out.
The first no was no intent. Alicia and Alexandra did not have the criminal intent the prosecution has to prove. They did not have the intent to deprive anyone of any property. Their intent was simply to aid animals who were suffering. And they believed in their heart of hearts that aiding those animals was their legal right. If there's no intent, you must acquit. I'm going to briefly talk about this, but my co-counsel did an excellent job discussing this. So what I'm really going to focus on is the other no and the yes. What was the second no? The second one was no value. Alexandra and Alicia did not take anything of value from foster farms, not even a slight amount. They took 2 of the sickest chickens you can find on the planet Earth from the back of that truck, and they did so just to give these animals emergency care. The prosecution has a burden to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that these chickens had some value, however slight, and sick birds have no value. Sick birds are a liability. So if the birds were sick, you must acquit. Those are the 2 no's. And again, I remind you of the burden of proof. We don't have to prove the birds were not sick. We don't have to prove the birds did not have value. The prosecution has the burden to prove beyond a reasonable doubt, the highest standard in the legal system, that the birds had some value and these defendants had some criminal intent. They're not going to be able to prove that. And if you even have one reasonable doubt about that, you have a duty to render a verdict of not guilty. And I also want to remind you of what I said during jury selection, that all of you have a duty to independently make this assessment. So if you're the only person in the jury who says, you know what, I don't think these chickens had any value, even if you're the one person, you have a duty to my clients who are facing a criminal prosecution to hold out and say, I don't think the evidence proved this. I don't think the evidence proved that these...
Proper argument and deliberation.
Oh. Then let's come to the yes. And I said in opening, and I'm going to say again today, the yes is more important than the no's, because the yes is what this case was about. There was no intent to take anything of value from foster farms. There was no value in these chickens. They were sick and a liability, a danger to consumers, to pets, and to the other birds at the farm. What did the evidence show in this case? The yes is rescue. These 2 women saw birds collapse on the floor of a slaughterhouse cage. They were desperate to help them because they knew these birds were suffering. And all they did was give these poor creatures some help. That's it. So let me get through these points again, now that we've seen all the evidence again. 2 no's and a yes. No intent, no value. But yes, this was a rescue. On the intent stuff, again, Mr. Carraway did an excellent job of setting out the evidence and the legal argument on behalf of the defense. I just want to point out a few things. One is, all the people who are actually involved in the rescue consistently said over and over again their intent was just to aid animals. You heard this from Celeste, you heard this from Alicia, you heard this from Alexandra, you heard this from everyone. There was nothing to contradict this testimony, that they were there not to steal anything, they were there to help. But it's not just what they did and what they said about what they did, it's what they did right after. They posted it to social media everywhere. They spoke to media outlets, including the New York Times. And here's the kicker. I promised you in the opening statement that there would be a kicker about what they did afterwards. Both before and right after the incident on September 28, 2021, the defendants and their organization contacted the authorities. Does that sound like someone who committed a crime or thought they committed a crime? You don't call the cops after you've committed a crime. You contact the authorities to report a crime. So ask yourself, how reasonable is it to conclude they had a belief their actions were lawful when they are contacting the authorities themselves? But as strong as that evidence is, and I think that's pretty strong and pretty definitive about their good faith belief, about the lawfulness of their actions, the strongest evidence yet is they talked to a law professor. Who are the people who profess the law for our society? Who are the people who teach the law for our society? Those people are the law professors. And this is not just a law professor. This is a distinguished criminal law expert who they reached out to, and they had a legal opinion. And what Professor Averon taught Alexandra and Alicia was that in certain circumstances, when there's an animal desperately in need and no one else is able to help, you have the right to help. You might say, how could they possibly believe this? You can't just run up to a car or a truck or someone's home and take their pet. But remember, this is a very conditional legal opinion. Compare it to a dog in a hot car. If you were to break into a car to steal someone's pet, of course that's a theft. No one's going to disagree with that. The defendants aren't going to agree with that. You can't just steal someone's pet. But if the dog is suffering, if it's a hot day and the owner inadvertently didn't leave their windows open, inadvertently didn't leave the air conditioning running, and you're watching that dog as she is slowly dying, being roasted alive in that car, they believe only in those circumstances you have the right to go ahead and break that window and take that dog to the vet.
And I'm going to object mistake of law. The law about dogs requires you to call 911 first. This is a misdirection.
Sustained.
So, but even if they're wrong, again, even if they're wrong, and they didn't have the right to help the animal issue, chicken, cow, pig, dog, whatever the animal is, even if they're wrong, if they had a good faith belief, even if they were mistaken about the right to rescue these animals, if they had a good faith belief, and that's all they need to show. In fact, we don't even have to show it. If they had a good faith belief, what that shows is the prosecution has not met its burden to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that these innocent women had no criminal intent. So again, if there is no intent, you must acquit. Brings me to the second issue, no value. And this is the issue I'm going to dive in a little more detail. Alexandra and Alicia, and everyone else who saw these chickens, said over and over again in this trial that these chickens not only did not have any value, but they were a liability. What did we hear to sustain this finding, this factual finding, these chickens were a liability? Well, first, the defendant's testimony themselves. They said they opened up the cage door and immediately saw 2 chickens collapse on the ground. There were a bunch of chickens standing, but there are 2 that are on the ground. If you're trying to take something of value, why do you take the animals that are collapsed? Second, they immediately see the pale, sickly combs, right? And I showed you the bright red color of the chicken right next to the chicken Alicia took. If they were trying to take healthy animals rather than sick animals, why would you take the one that's collapsed on the ground with a pale comb rather than the chicken right next to that chicken that has a bright red, healthy comb? And they both testified that these birds obviously were sitting in their own excrement. There's no animal on this planet that likes sitting in their own excrement. You can see from the video footage itself how dirty their feathers are. These animals have not just been sitting there, unable to walk. They've been sitting there, unable to walk, in their own excrement for a while. Does this suggest they're trying to take something of value? Or does this suggest they're taking birds that are so sick and so broken that they have no value to foster farms? And then we come to Celeste Yamada's testimony. This is the woman who spent the most time with these 2 chickens in the days before one of them died, and one of them, after intensive care, managed to survive. What did Celeste say? Well, the first thing she told us was, honestly, when I saw these chickens, I thought both of them were going to die. And again, this is not some random person they pulled off the street. This is a certified vet tech who had 400 hours of training who started a sanctuary for abused and abandoned chickens. And she said, in my experience, these chickens look like they're about to die. They were so weak and unwilling to eat that she had to move them back and forth to food. Have you ever had a pet that you had to literally pick up and take them to food? They had 4 separate medications immediately. They didn't wait days, right? It wasn't 3 days later. Within hours, that video footage of Celeste giving the birds medication was shot hours after they were removed, right? You don't give birds meloxicam, Clavamox, Procosa, and ivermectin, 4 medications. You don't give anyone 4 very significant medications if those animals aren't very, very sick. She even created a sling to hold them up. Do you remember this? Because she thought, oh, if the birds just sit in their excrement all day, they're going to develop pneumonia burns. You can't just sit in your excrement all day. And she woke up. She said, I barely slept 20 minutes. I had to get up every 20 minutes to make sure these birds weren't sitting on their excrement because I was afraid they were going to die from the burns in their own body from being unable to walk. So that was Celeste's testimony. But then we got the prosecution's argument, and the prosecution's witness, Shane Sutton. They called at the last minute. And Mr. Sutton says, well, actually, no, maybe the birds were sick, but they still had some value to us because we're going to render them. We're going to feed them to people's pets. You remember that testimony? But then we dug a little more into his testimony and his background. And it turns out using sick chickens is a direct contradiction of Foster Farms' own promises to the public. I showed Mr. Sutton those promises in that advertising. He said, we raise chickens free from injury, pain, or disease. Our veterinarians ensure there's no disease. And suddenly now he's saying, oh no, we have lots of diseased chickens, but don't worry. We don't sell them to you. We just sell them to your pets. How plausible is that? Then we learned further that Mr. Sutton's only been at Foster Farms for a few months. Yet he's opining about the condition of chickens from 3 years ago, or 2 years ago. And then finally, here was the weirdest thing to me. We find out that he doesn't actually know anything about rendering at all because he is an accounting executive who admits on the stand after we question him, I have no expertise and you really have to ask him that. So here's an example of his testimony. Question. You don't know what sorts of diseases or risks are posed by putting animals with particular sicknesses in the rendering process, do you? Answer. That is correct. I have stated that I am not a rendering expert. Question. You don't have the qualifications to determine whether they had a disease that meant they were prohibited from being transported for rendering. Answer. That is correct. Question. Even more reason to trust a veterinarian. Answer. That is correct. Even more reason to trust a veterinarian. Not our words. This is their witnesses. I'm going to come back to that in a moment. But the final point on Sutton, and I think the point that is just definitive on his testimony, is this. Mr. Sutton is an accounting executive, a vice president. He's someone who's only been there at Foster Farms for a few months, and all of us, including me, were wondering, why is an accounting executive testifying in a petty theft case about rendering and disease? And then we get the answer from his testimony. Why was he testifying? Why was he saying these strange things about rendering? Because a Foster Farms lawyer instructed him on exactly what to say.
In proper argument, Your Honor.
Sustained.
So I'll just recite back from his testimony. Question. Did you ask Michael, Michael's Foster Farms attorney, how you should answer the questions today? Answer. Yes. Question. Did Michael give you an answer? No, don't give me the content of the answer, but just did he give you an answer? Answer. Yes. Question. So you ask, can I take a moment and ask Michael to the prosecution's question about the value of the birds? He did give you an answer, didn't he? Answer. Yes. So what the evidence showed you is that a lawyer for Foster Farms who has no expertise in rendering is telling an executive, an accounting executive at Foster Farms who also has no experience in rendering or animal disease, whether it's safe to render birds for
Objection,
pet.
misstates the testimony, proper argument.
Sustained.
I'll just ask you, does that make any sense to you? Probably not. But here's the picture. Would you trust someone's opinion if they admitted to you, and this is not us and our defense evidence, but this is his own admissions to you, 4 very important things. First, he admits to you that the company has been saying they don't have sick animals. Again, the website itself, he admitted it. We say we don't have sick animals because we have veterinarians making sure all the sick animals are removed. Turns out we actually do have sick chickens, we just sell them to pets. That's what he admitted to you. So would you trust a company that said one thing on their website, but then turned around and said something else on the stand? Second, would you trust someone who himself says, I'm not qualified to testify about any of these subjects? Again, not our words, his. Third, would you trust someone who told you, I'm not qualified, there is someone else who is qualified, and that, by the way, I'm saying things are the opposite of what she says. But by the way, you should trust her and not me. I mean, isn't he kind of admitting that you really shouldn't listen to anything I have to say? Listen to Dr. Rosenberg. And fourth, admitting, I actually was instructed by my lawyers what to say.
Your Honor, I'm going to object again, in proper argument.
Can I approach you on it?
The objection is sustained.
So again, for those 4 reasons, you have to ask yourself, and the judge gave you instructions on why you should trust or maybe not trust a witness. You have your own personal intuitions. I'm going to ask you to look at his own words and ask yourself, should I trust what he's saying? Or does this sound like corporate doublespeak? Does this sound like someone testifying just to ensure these women get convicted? Okay, but there's one thing, and only one thing maybe, that I agree with Mr. Sutton on, and that is, if you want to understand disease and value of diseased and sick animals, the person to trust is the vet. And guess what? The only vet to testify in this trial is Dr. Hsiung Rosenberg. And this is not just any doctor. This is someone who was trained at Stanford in the best livestock school in the country. She has given individualized care to over 1,000 animals over the last 10 years, focused especially on determining which animals can be used for commerce and which cannot. focused especially on the diseased, abused, and abandoned animals that the industry determines has no value. She has worked at commercial animal farms. She has worked with sanctuaries. And she even worked with these two defendants to determine whether these animals were sick. And what was Dr. Rosenberg's opinion? The opinion that Mr. Sutton said, trust her opinion, trust the vet's opinion, because I don't know. I'm the county executive. What do I know about vets and diseases and enterococcus? I mean, none of us. I mean, I don't know what any of these diseases are. I've got to trust Dr. Rosenberg and healthcare professionals too. Right? And what did Dr. Rosenberg, the person even the state's witness said we should trust, say about the condition and value of these birds? She said this: the birds in this case cannot be sold, they can't be rendered, they can't even be legally transported because they are a danger to both animal and human health. And she gave 3 reasons why these chickens were in terrible shape and cannot be transported, cannot be sold, cannot be rendered. The first is they're very sick, and a sick bird is unlawful to sell for any purpose. Sepsis, gout, infectious bronchitis virus, organ failure, and infection in 7 different organ groups. These birds were unfit for any process, and she even testified about an entire concept in the industry. Do you remember the term pre-slaughter mortality? There's some birds that end up in commerce in some fashion, but there are a lot of birds, because a lot of companies like Foster Farms do a terrible job of caring for these animals. There are a lot of birds who don't even end up in commerce, and that is pre-slaughter mortality. And what was the number she gave? 500 million annually. And she's testified very definitively, with no doubt whatsoever, as an expert in this area, these birds inevitably would have ended up in that category of 500 million birds dying or cold in pre-slaughter mortality. There's a second reason. It wasn't just that these birds themselves were unfit for commerce. There's a second reason. She said these birds are a danger and a liability, and that is they could spread diseases through the entire farm. Remember that infectious coronavirus she talked about? 100% morbidity, meaning any birds that come into contact with the fluids or secretions of this bird are going to get sick. That's what morbidity means. 100% of them are going to get sick. And then for this particular strain, do you remember the nephropathogenic strain with secondary infections? This particular strain causes up to 60% mortality. So it's not just that this bird had no value themselves. Every 10 birds you bring next to this sick bird, 6 of them are also going to die. And that disease can spread like wildfire through the entire farm. And that's exactly why Dr. Rosenberg also testified you cannot transport these birds. Under veterinary protocols and the regulations we follow as veterinarians, you cannot transport these birds. And we all know this. We've been through COVID-19. We know when you're sick, you can't just go running around, walking around, and cough on people, sneeze on people, touch all the surfaces. I mean, that's ridiculous. Yet that's what they would have you believe. Well, actually not, exactly. Because one of the witnesses also conceded that the trucks are never cleaned. The trucks are filled with filth. Do you remember Leo Hernandez saying this? It's not his fault. It's a company. The company has no policy of cleaning these trucks. So you've got diseased birds, trucks that are never cleaned, and yet somehow the prosecution would have you believe that this disease that causes 100% morbidity and 60% mortality for this particular strain, totally valuable. Well, we love these birds. Okay, third, and most importantly, the reason Dr. Rosenberg told you these birds are a liability is because they had diseases that could hurt you and your family, the consumers. E. coli, enterococcus, and not just E. coli and enterococcus, but diseases in unexpected places, diseases that normally you'd see in the GI tract. Remember saying, and I had to explain what the GI tract is, the stomach and the intestines. We've found these infections in other places where they shouldn't be, which shows these are particularly pathogenic and probably multi-drug-resistant strains of enterococcus and E. coli. And these are infections that often spread in environments where human beings are vulnerable, like hospitals. Do you remember the term nosocomial? I might be pronouncing it incorrectly, sorry, but that's what I heard. Nosocomial infections. Those are infections of people in hospitals. And she told you about research showing that for people with enterococcus infections, these nosocomial infections, some studies show that 66.7% of people who get this infection in a hospital environment will die. Die! This is why these birds are a liability. This is why these birds had no value to Foster Farms or to anyone else. And unlike Mr. Sutton, Dr. Rosenberg's testimony is very credible. For one, her opinion did not change. Again, she had these opinions about the birds when Celeste and Alicia and Alexandra presented them to her initially through teleconference. in 2021. There was no litigation. There was no reason for her to give them bad advice. She was trying to save these birds' lives. So she told them, give them meloxicam, give them Clavamox, give them Procosa, give them ivermectin, give them all these medications because these birds seem really sick. And her opinion hasn't changed. So the prosecution is trying to say she's biased, but in fact, would she have been biased against them back in 2021? Well, she gave them the same opinion back in 2021 as she was giving in court this week. Second, unlike Mr. Sutton or Foster Farm's lawyers, she is not an executive or an accountant at a big corporation with no experience in animal disease. She's someone who spent the last 23 years of her life focused on exactly this, protecting animals and human beings from disease. And third, she's the only expert in this case who actually looked at the evidence. Mr. Sutton himself said, well, I don't know anything about these birds. I don't know anything about render. I don't know anything about anything. I wasn't even working at Foster Farms in September 2021. The only person who's an expert and actually looked at this evidence made a very clear assessment. These birds are a liability. They're a danger. Okay, but, and this is maybe the kicker. You know, there's a kicker on the first point, no intent. This is the kicker, the trump card on value. The kicker is this. It was not just Dr. Rosenberg's opinion. It was also an independent necropsy, a medical record from the best veterinary school in the nation, UC Davis. In fact, a veterinary school that usually works for the livestock industry. That was testified. They don't work for animal advocates. UC Davis works for the livestock industry. And what did that record show? It showed things even more disturbing than what Dr. Rosenberg had initially found. Remember her saying, this is one of the most disturbing necropsies I've ever seen. These are extraordinarily sick birds. Because what did the necropsy show? A variant of infectious bronchitis virus, and I encourage you to actually look at the exhibit yourself in deliberation. And this is a quote that causes remarkable economic losses. Remarkable economic losses. It showed another disease called gout that causes, quote, huge mortality. Most terrifyingly, the necropsy also confirms there were 2 secondary infections in an unusual place in the bird's eyes. It's even marked as one of the reasons these birds die is they had an eye infection. And that eye infection was so bad they couldn't even keep their eyes open. You remember that bird in daylight just going, that was Jack's. That was the healthy bird. It's the so-called healthy bird. Couldn't even keep her eyes open. And confirmed that these infections are dangerous, and dangerous to other animals, and dangerous to human health. So scientific and medical records don't usually use inflammatory language. Scientists, if you have any scientists in your life, you probably know. They're used to using kind of very neutral language. And yet the words in this scientific medical report sound like they came from a horror movie. Mortality, sepsis, enterococcus, death. And these are the words, again, not of an animal advocate, not by anyone who has any bias, not by anyone who is preparing a report for litigation, because this happened immediately after the birds died, long before these women were even charged. These are the words of the best vet school in the nation, the vet school that everybody in the state of California, every industry, company, every sanctuary, everyone who's got an animal who needs a necropsy, they send them through the statewide system and it gets to UC Davis, and they found that these birds were desperately sick and would cause remarkable economic losses. Remarkable economic losses. A loss is negative. A loss is a liability. And I just want to point out one thing. They've tried to point out there's some difference between Jax and Ethan, right? We showed you on the video footage. Jax had a pink comb too. We showed you video footage showing Jax wasn't walking either. And we cited evidence, or Dr. Rosenberg cited evidence, that any 2 birds that come into direct contact with each other, and these birds were sitting right next to each other in the slaughterhouse and the factory farm. Any 2 birds that come into direct contact with each other with this disease that causes remarkable economic losses, 100% of the time they're sick. And that's completely consistent with all the symptoms. You look at all the symptoms of these 2 birds. So both of these birds were in the same condition. Both of these birds were dangerous to both other animals and human health. Let me just sum this up and try and use a common sense argument. If I come up to you one day and say, hey, you know, I got this animal, she's got a disease, it's going to cause remarkable economic losses and huge mortality to any other animals you have, how much are you going to pay me for this bird? If I went further and said, oh, by the way, I forgot to tell you, not only does this bird have a disease, a coronavirus, that will cause remarkable economic losses and huge mortality to all your animals, sorry about that, but further, forgot to say this bird also has 2 secondary infections that could kill your kids. How much are you going to pay for that bird? You're not going to pay for that bird. You're going to run away. To believe their story, to believe their story, you would have to think that Foster Farms is deliberately infecting and destroying its own animals and endangering human beings. And as bad as my opinion of Foster Farms, I don't believe that. I don't think Foster Farms is going to deliberately try and kill kids in hospitals. But that's what you have to believe their story about value. So I'll say it again. The second no, very clear and definitive. And again, we don't have to prove it. You don't have to believe me. Even if you think there's a reasonable doubt about anything I've said about value, if there is a reasonable conclusion you could reach that these birds didn't have value based on the evidence I just shared with you, kids dying in hospitals, chickens dying at the farm, the fact that the chickens were unfit for consumption for any purpose, if you have a reasonable doubt on value, you have a duty to render a verdict of not guilty. So just to summarize, if the birds were sick, you must acquit. Okay, so now we get to what I think, in my view at least, is a central point. It's the third key issue, and this time we're talking about not a no, but a yes. Because while the evidence in this case didn't show any intent to commit a crime, didn't show any value from the property taken, these are birds that were sick and a liability for the company, it did show something else that is very legally important. And what it showed...
Counsel, can you approach? Let's talk a little bit about scheduling. When you come back, then you're just going to start with deliberations at that point. So we may go beyond a little bit 12. I ask for your indulgence so we can move right along.
Okay. I'm sorry for being a little long-winded. I have a lot of things to say, as you can see. But I promise you I'm going to wrap up shortly on this third issue. And this third issue is, if this is a rescue, not a theft, you must acquit. Let me explain by starting with some backdrop about my client. This woman, Alexandra Paul, this is someone who spent her entire life helping people in need. When she was a star of a television series in the 80s, she didn't go do drugs or party the way a lot of actors did. What did we hear in testimony? She went to high schools to teach kids self-esteem. When she saw homeless people on the street, I mean, a lot of us, including me, I live in San Francisco, we turn away and say, like, I don't want to get too close to that. She brought these people into her home and let them live with her. And to this day, she still goes to a soup kitchen every week to serve people in need. You heard testimony. That client, after a lifetime of trying helping human beings and animals, was awakened to animal suffering. She read about what happens in these awful slaughterhouses where the lines are moving so fast that animals often ripped to pieces alive. She was heartbroken by the things she heard about, the things she saw, and she decided to make it her life's work. That does not show the intent to commit a crime. That shows the intent to help. And you heard testimony that she specifically obtained very concrete, detailed information about animals who needed help at Foster Farms in August of 2021. And not only did she find out about this, but she tried to get the authorities to help. They begged the corporation. They begged all the agencies they could possibly reach out to. They sent letters by Bonnie Clapper. You remember her name? The experienced attorney who sent letters saying that we have evidence that animals are being neglected and mutilated. We have evidence that animals are being scalded alive. And we find out in testimony in this case that no one even bothers to read the complaint. Remember what Sergeant Kirk said? And it's not his fault. It's a bigger problem, but here's the testimony. Are you aware of anyone in your office investigating allegations that animals were, quote, scalded alive? Scalded alive. Not slaughtered humanely. Dropped into a boiling tank of water because they've been improperly stung. And his answer, I'm not. No. Question, are you aware of anyone in your office who even read the complaint that animals were, quote, scalded alive at Foster Farms in September of 2021? Answer, I'm unaware if anyone did or not. No. What should she have done in a situation like this? Now, you might not understand why these two women love chicken so much. And honestly, I get it. When I talk to Alicia sometimes, I say to myself, she's kind of a crazy chicken lady. No offense. Sorry, Alicia. But then I listen to her testify in court. I see the smile on her face when she's talking about a little chicken who follows around at work and won't leave her side. I hear stories like Alexandra's story about rescuing a chicken from the bottom of a garbage can buried alive, taking that chicken home, and thinking the same thing that I thought about Alicia and people who love chickens, and then realizing, wow, every time I walk in this room, this chicken perks up and is so happy to see me. Except when I give her medicine, and then she turns her head away. And she realizes, this chicken's just like my cats. This chicken is a living being. You hear stories like Celeste's story. Do you remember her talking about how much she loved animals, and she developed this intense love of birds to the point that when she's caring for sick animals, even when she has to wake up every 20 minutes to clean up their poop, she loves them that much. I hear stories like these women's stories, and I start to get it. What we need to get is these women love animals, and that's not a crime. They love the cats and dogs in their homes. They love the tigers in the forest and the dolphins in the seas. And yes, they love chickens too, because they believe that all the animals of this earth, no matter how weak, no matter how vulnerable, no matter if they're a chicken, a dog, or a dolphin, all the animals of this earth deserve to be treated like living beings. Not garbage, but like living beings. And that's why they were there on September 28th. Now, we may not love chickens the way these women do, but most of us probably have animals in our lives that we love. And in trying to understand their intent on that day, even if you don't love chickens the way I do, I think we have to ask ourselves how we would act if an animal we loved was hurt, was desperately in need of help. Maybe it's an old mutt one of us adopted off the street. Maybe it's a stray kitten you picked up. But whoever that animal is, if one of us found out that an animal we loved was being hurt, what would we do? You heard from Daphne Zuniga that when she's facing a difficult situation, what does she do? She asks herself, what would Alexandra do? And I'm betting that many of us, if an animal was hurt and we love them, I'm betting that many of us would have the same intent. We would take the same action. We would not leave that animal to starve to death on the floor of a slaughterhouse truck or be boiled alive in an abusive slaughterhouse. We would help. We would rescue. And that's not something our society should condemn. That's not the worst in us. That's the best in us. That's the best in each of you. So I'm going to end by doing something that's a little unusual and honestly a little risky in a criminal case. Because normally in criminal cases, lawyers are trying to sow doubt. I'm trying to sell you, no, my client didn't do it. Know this, know this, know this. No, doubt, doubt, doubt. I'm going to do something very different. I'm going to say the opposite and tell you, my client did it. My client wasn't wrong. It was right. The world's a hard place for the weak and vulnerable. And a little chicken might not seem like much put up against one of the largest poultry processing companies in the world. But to these two defendants, these two women, all the living creatures of this earth deserve protection, even the weakest and most vulnerable. And yes, that even goes for a sick little chicken on the floor of a slaughterhouse truck. We started this question and this trial with that why question. It's not just what these women did, but why they did it. And why did they do what they did? I think the answer, quite clearly from the evidence you heard, is they did that to make this world a slightly kinder place. They did what they did because they wanted foster farms to take animal welfare a little more seriously. Please, for the love of God, just don't boil animals alive. That's not too much to ask. They did what they did because they wanted officers like Sergeant Kirk to be empowered to investigate animal cruelty, even when it's being inflicted by one of the most powerful corporations in the state against some of the weakest creatures on our planet. And they did what they did because they knew somewhere out there was a little bird, sick and scared, and collapsed on the floor of a slaughterhouse truck. He was crying out for help. And what Alexandra and Alicia intended, what they want more than anything in the world, is for that little bird, who has never known any kindness in her life, to feel love for the first time in her life. Members of the jury, that is not a theft. That is a rescue. And rescuing sick and dying animals simply is not a crime. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Hsiung. Mr. Colby, rebuttal.
I'm going to agree with defense counsel on one point. A very important point that is not relevant to this trial, but he said it, so I'll agree with him. Loving animals is not a crime. Most people have pets. Imagine, the dog, if you will, that you have at home that might love you and you love it back, and it might mean more to you than anything in the world. And anybody's owned dogs, they know that sometimes they do things that, make you recoil a bit. I mean, if anybody's ever had a dog that eats their own poop, that's happens, and it's kind of disgusting a bit, isn't it? But think about this. The argument you just heard is that they can go take something because they believe it's not being treated as correctly as they would.
Objection, that's a misstatement of the argument in the mistake of law defense.
So they believe they can take something because they would treat it differently than the owner would. That's not the law. The law does not say you can take something because you would treat it differently. Now, one thing defense counsel didn't do is cite the law, and I'm going to get to that in just a quick second here, and I promise you I'll be brief. But they're doing something to be activists and advocate for a certain point. This is not the forum for that. They disagree with rendering of a chicken for any uses, but Dr. Rosenberg admitted under cross-exam, yeah, rendering occurs, but I disagree with it. I want the law to change. So that's not the legal defense here. When they took these chickens, they took them, and it's been very clear why. When you've heard the argument now, you know this is an attack on foster farms. Plain and simple. Accusing foster farms of ills that are not an issue here. Foster farms is not on trial. The issue of whether or not the birds are sick are only for the limited purpose of, do these birds actually have value? Well, they have value to foster farms. Defense may want to tell you that they don't have value. They might want to jump up and down and say these birds were so sick that they had no value. But think about what was said. 100% morbidity, 60% mortality. The way it was described to you is that those birds were not only so sick, but so transmissible that they would have affected everything. By the sheer law statistics, they would affect every single bird on that truck, every single bird everywhere. Foster farms would not be in existence. Everybody would be sick and dropping dead.
Your Honor, objection misstates testimony.
Actually, it does not.
It does mistake the testimony. That is not what Dr. Rosenberg said.
So the law of probabilities tells you
Argument.
with 100% mortality, morbidity, and a 60% mortality, that the entire foster farm business would have been decimated. Now, what else? Yes, they talk about this letter in 2018, written to Direct Action Everywhere, saying you might have this defense. In California, you cannot take something because you think you'd treat it better. Now, are there other opinions? Yes, they ignore them.
Objection to facts, not in evidence.
Foster farms.
One sec. I'm not sure where you're going with this, but counsel, go ahead and state your, continue, and then before we issue this ruling.
Witnesses were asked, are you aware that Foster Farms is certified humane? They said,
Objection misstates testimony. It's American Humane Certified, not Certified Humane. There's a difference. There's a big difference.
Objection sustained.
fine. They were asked, are you aware of an entity that certified Foster Farms as humane for the past 8 years? They said yes. Do you put any value in that? No, they don't. They're ignoring it. They're looking at what they want to hear. You heard the last witness tell you that there's USDA inspectors at Foster Farms. Are they ignoring that too? They're hearing what they want to hear. And that's not a defense. Now, I promised you I'd be quick. The issue of value only goes to, for petty theft of property taken, can be of any value, no matter how slight. It's clear that happened. Now let's talk about mistake of law, finally. Defense counsel talked a lot about mistake of law, but didn't read the instruction to you exactly. Defendant is not guilty of petty theft if she made an honest or good faith mistake about the law. There is not a reasonable possibility here that they didn't know it was against the law. What really happened is...
Your Honor, objection. This is misstating the law. Can we approach?
One second. Okay. The instruction is instruction. Ladies and gentlemen, again, if the attorney's comments on the law conflict with the instruction, follow the instruction.
Okay. The instruction says the defendant is not guilty of petty theft if she made an honest or good faith mistake about the law. That about the law part was left out when they talked about it. So they clearly understood it was against the law, and that's relevant and that's obvious from the testimony here. They knew it was against the law, they did it anyways.
Your Honor, I'm going to object again. Can we approach?
Sometimes I forget things too, but the defendant is not guilty of petty theft if she makes an honest or good faith mistake about the law, if that mistake shows they did not have the specific intent. What do they tell you? Well, because of this letter, I thought I had a defense to it. It doesn't say I didn't intend to take the chickens and I didn't deprive Foster Farms of it. So these arguments that there was some mistake of law, and these arguments that the chickens have no value, are quite frankly disingenuous with the entire...
Objection, denigration of defense counsel and arguments.
Talking about witnesses, Your Honor.
Or
These arguments that are the evidence that they said that this relates to mistake of law and value are disingenuous and counterintuitive with the fact that this was a plan, this was a big protest that was there, blocking the ingress and egress to Foster Farms. And you saw the video, they ran up, split second, took the chickens, ran off. That really doesn't square with that, does it? It doesn't square with the fact that these chickens have no value now. They're taking something that has no value. Now they're saying no value to Foster Farms. But really, it's on a Foster Farms truck. It's going to Foster Farms plant. If Foster Farms told you it has value. Now you may not like Foster Farms. You may not like the value and what they use it for. That's understandable. But again, we're not talking about thoughts. And I'll leave you with this, motive. People are not required to prove the defendant had a motive to commit the crime. In reaching a verdict, you may consider whether they have a motive. That's not specific intent. The motive of I want to help animals is, I'll concede that's exactly what was in their head. They want to help animals through this. I call it an activist stunt. Maybe that's too harsh, but that's what I'll call it. Question is the specific intent. When they took the property, did they intend to deprive the owner of the property of that property? You can't just take somebody, some company, some person's animal because you think you've treated them. So, ladies and gentlemen, they are both guilty and they should be found guilty. Thank you.
Thank you, counsel. All right, ladies and gentlemen, when you go to the jury room, the first thing you should do is choose a foreperson. The foreperson should see to it that your discussions are carried on with jurors. Do not hesitate to change your mind if you become convinced that you are wrong. But do not change your mind just because other jurors disagree with you. Keep an open mind and openly exchange your thoughts and ideas about this case. Stating your opinions too strongly at the beginning or immediately announcing how you plan to vote may interfere with an open discussion. Please treat one another courteously. Your role is to be an impartial judge of the facts, not to act as an advocate for one side or the other. As I told you at the beginning of the trial, do not talk about the case or about any of the people or any subject involved in it with anyone, including but not limited to your spouse or other family or friends, spiritual leaders or advisors or therapists. You must discuss the case only in the jury room and only when all jurors are present. Do not discuss your deliberations with anyone else. Do not communicate using any form of social media or electronic device during your deliberations. It is very important that you not use the internet in any way in connection with this case during your deliberations. During the trial, several items were received into evidence as exhibits. You may examine whatever exhibits you think will help you in your deliberations. These exhibits will be sent to the jury room with you when you begin to deliberate. If you need to communicate with me while you are deliberating, you send a note through the bailiff, signed by the foreperson or by one or more members of the jury. To have a complete record of this trial, it is important that you not communicate with me except by a written note. If you have questions, I will talk with the attorneys before I answer, so it may take some time. You should continue your deliberations while you wait for my answer. I will answer questions in writing or orally here in open court. Do not reveal to me or anyone else how the vote stands on the question of guilt unless I ask you to do so. Your verdict on each count and any special findings must be unanimous. This means that to return a verdict, all of you must agree to it. It is not my role to tell you what your verdict should be. Do not take anything I said or did during the trial as an indication of what I think about the facts, the witnesses, or what your verdict should be. You must reach your verdict without any consideration of punishment. You will be given verdict forms. As soon as all jurors have agreed on a verdict, the foreperson must state and sign the appropriate verdict form and notify the bailiff. If you are able to reach a unanimous decision on only one or only some of the charges, fill in that verdict form only and notify the bailiff. return any unsigned verdict form. All right, I'm gonna have my clerk swear in the bailiff, and then he's gonna take the 12 regular jurors first.
Do you solemnly swear that you will keep this jury together in some quiet and convenient place, and that you will not permit any person to speak with them, to them, or speak to them yourself unless by order of the court, or to ask them whether they have agreed upon a verdict, and that you will return them into court when they have so agreed, or when by order by the court?
I do.
All right, so the 12 regular jurors, I'm gonna go ahead and excuse you now for lunch. Please return at 1:30, okay, and the bailiff, if you want, they know where to return.
Your notebooks this time, and come on back, I'll get that with you.
And the 2 alternates, if you please don't leave just yet. All right, juror 13 and 14, the 2 alternates, after lunch, they will begin deliberating, but you are still the alternate jurors and are bound by my earlier instructions about your conduct. Okay, do not talk about the case or about any of the people or any subject involved in it with anyone, not even family, friends, not even with each other. Okay, do not have any contact with the deliberating jurors. Do not decide how you would vote if you are deliberating. And do not form or express an opinion about the issues in this case unless you are substituted in for one of the deliberating jurors. Okay, so you are also excused for lunch. And what I would ask you to do is remain within, are both of you folks within half an hour of the courthouse?
Yeah.
No.
Okay. You're not?
No.
Okay, where are you at?
Los Baños?
Oh, you're in Los Baños?
Yeah.
Okay. So that would be about 45 minutes to an hour. Okay, what is your plan today, to head home?
I mean, yeah.
Okay. All right, so I think that should be fine.
Okay.
But what I would ask is pay attention to your cell phone. And so if you are called in to substitute for one of the jurors, you can be here within the hour. Okay?
All right.
All right. If I don't see, and if the jurors have reached a verdict and your services are no longer needed, my clerk will also call you and let you know. Okay? But on behalf of the court, if I don't see you again, I want to thank you for your attentiveness and thank you for your time and effort to be here to serve as alternate jurors. I don't want you to think that as alternate jurors you have not contributed to this and your service is not significant. It is very significant, very important. And so I want to thank you for what you did and for your civic duty. Okay? All right, thank you, sir. All right, counsel, if you haven't already, please leave your cell number to my clerk so she can be in touch with you.